And I want to wake up in your white, white sun. And I want to wake up in your world with no pain. But I'll just suffer in a hope to die someday while you are numb all of the way. When I hate it, I know I can feel. But when you love, you know it's not real. No. The future we see is not a poet's world. When a choice of one of two flags unfurled burns a crisp shell around our country's will, what place is there for folly and frill? Folly only when nobody's laughing, frill on only our epitaphing. Poetry only for slogan writing. Hunger only for sheepdogs biting. We're on chapter 5, which is called Food. So let's take a little read. 1. If the coming revolution is to be a social revolution, it will be distinguished from all former uprisings not only by its aim, but also by its methods. To attain a new end, new means are required. The 3 great popular movements which we have seen in France during the last 100 years differ from each other in many ways, but they have one common feature. In each case, the people strove to overturn the old regime and spent their heart's blood for the cause. Then, after having borne the brunt of the battle, they sank again into obscurity. A government composed of men more or less honest was formed and undertook to organize the Republic in 1793, Labor in 1848, and the Free Commune in 1871. Imbued with Jacobin ideas, this government occupied itself, first of all, with the political questions, such as the reorganization of the machinery of government, the purifying of the administration, the separation of church and state, civic liberty, and such matters. It is true, the workmen's clubs kept an eye on the members of the new government, and often imposed their ideas on them. But even in these clubs, whether the leaders belonged to the middle or to the working classes, it was always middle-class ideas which prevailed. They discussed various political questions at great length, but forgot to discuss the question of bread. Great ideas spring up at such times, ideas that have moved the world. Words are spoken which still stir our hearts at the interval of a century. But the people were starving in the slums. From the very commencement of the revolution, industry inevitably came to a stop. The circulation of produce was checked, and capital concealed itself. The master, the employer, had nothing to fear at such times. He battened on his dividends, if indeed he did not speculate on the wretchedness around. But the wage earner was reduced to live from hand to mouth. Want knocked at the door. Famine was abroad in the land, such famine as had hardly been seen under the old regime. The Girondists are starving us, was the cry in the workmen's quarters in 1793. I can't remember who Girondin was. That's a name that's very familiar, but can't remember who he was. And thereupon the Girondists were guillotined, and full powers were given to the Mountain and to the Commune. The Commune indeed concerned itself with the question of bread, and made heroic efforts to feed Paris. At Lyon, Fouché, and Collot d'Herbois established city granaries. But the sums spent on filling them were woefully insufficient. The town councils made great efforts to procure corn. The bakers who hoarded flour were hanged, and the people still lacked bread. Usually we have one comment by now. Let me just check and see if we're streaming at all. It appears that we are. Hello. The want only grew. For the wage earner cannot live without his wage, and the wage was not forthcoming. What difference could 1,000 corpses more or less make to him? Then the people began to grow weary. So much for your vaunted revolution. You are more wretched than ever before, whispered the reactionary in the ears of the worker. And little by little, the rich took courage, emerged from their hiding places, and flaunted their luxury in the face of the starving multitude. They dressed up like scented fops and said to the workers, "Come, enough of this foolery. What have you gained by rebellion?" Sick at heart, his patience at an end, the revolutionary had at last to admit to himself that the cause was lost once more. He retreated into his hovel and awaited the worst. Then reaction proudly asserted itself and accomplished a politic stroke. The revolution dead, nothing remained but to trample its corpse underfoot. The White Terror began. Blood flowed like water. The guillotine was never idle. The prisons were crowded, while the pageant of rank and fashion resumed its old course, and went on as merrily as before. This picture is typical of all our revolutions. In 1848, the workers of Paris placed 3 months' starvation at the service of the Republic, and then, having reached the limit of their powers, they made one last desperate effort, an effort which was drowned in blood. In 1871, the Commune perished for lack of combatants. It had taken measures for the separation of church and state, but it neglected, alas, until too late, to take measures for providing the people with bread. And so it came to pass that I never know how to do French plurals. I know that les in French, les, is a plural for the, and that's pronounced les. So, by that general rule, it would be elegante. But that sounds too Italian, but whatever. So it came to pass that elegantes and fine gentlemen could spurn the Confederates and bid them go sell their lives for a miserable pittance, and leave their betters to feast at their ease in fashionable restaurants. I believe Les Miserables. I think that's how you pronounce that plural. Miserables. That's how I've heard it pronounced before. So would this be elegante? I don't know. Elegant. Would it just be elegant? Maybe. At last the commune saw its mistake and opened communal kitchens, but it was too late. Its days were already numbered, and the troops of Versailles were on the ramparts. Yeah, I mean, kind of what's the point if you're doing a commune? What's the point of doing that if you're not going to provide people with food? Like, that should be the basic first step of any commune. Like, how do we get food? Let's figure that out. Bread. It is bread that the revolution needs. Let others spend their time in issuing pompous proclamations, in decorating themselves lavishly with official gold lace, and in talking about political liberty. Be it ours to see, from the very first day of the revolution to the last, in all the provinces fighting for freedom, that there is not a single man who lacks bread. Not a single woman compelled to stand with the weariful crowd outside the bakehouse door that a haply coarse loaf might be thrown to her in charity. Not a single child pining for want of food. It has always been the middle-class idea to harangue about great principles, great lies, rather. The idea of the people will be to provide bread for all, and while middle-class citizens and workmen infested with middle-class ideas admire their own rhetoric in the talking shops, and practical people are engaged in endless discussions on forms of government, we, the utopian dreamers, we shall have to consider the question of daily bread. We have the temerity to declare that all have a right to bread, that there is bread enough for all, and that this watchword of bread for all, the revolution will triumph with this watchword. So this is really kind of a dated idea these days in the first world. In the third world, this is still very much a concern. In the first world, however, the idea of bread being a concern is kind of out of date. Like, nobody wants for bread these days. And we have, like, soup kitchens. We have so many ways for people to get food in this country that it's, like, almost impossible to starve in this country. And so really, like, this is one way that capitalism has succeeded. It has in the over a century since this book was published. We've figured out bread. We figured it out. And so you can't really appeal to people based on bread anymore. How are ta elegante. Okay. It would be, how art thou, I guess, would be the, unless you're speaking some other weird dialect, but it would normally be, how art thou, or how are ye? The Prussian army wasn't going to allow that to stick around. Well, the thing is with that is, when I say that the commune's first goal should be providing food, I mean it should be the second goal. Obviously, the first goal is to defend itself. The second goal is food. Can't get food in a ruined, war-torn city very easily. The way he was describing it in this book made it seem like that wasn't even the first thing on their agenda, though. The army blockaded the city as well. Yes, we have food banks with cheap non-perishables given out for free. Yeah. It's really hard to starve in this country. It's downright impossible a lot of the time. 2. That we are utopians is well known. So utopian we are, so utopian are we, that we go to the length of believing that the revolution can and ought to assure shelter, food, and clothes to all, an idea extremely displeasing to middle-class citizens, whatever their party color, for they are quite alive to the fact that it is not easy to keep the upper hand of a people whose hunger is satisfied. All the same, we maintain our contention. Bread must be found for the people of the revolution, and the question of bread must take precedence of all other questions. If it is settled in the interests of the people, the revolution will be on the right road, for in solving the question of bread, we must accept the principle of equality, which will force itself upon us to the exclusion of every other solution. So the thing about this is that I think these days in the first world, our standards have gotten a lot higher. So it's these things, shelter, food, and clothes, are no longer... Shelter, I think, is still a big deal, but food and clothes are no longer the big deal they used to be. It's very easy to find cheap food. It's very easy to find cheap clothes. It's not so easy to find cheap shelter, though. So that's where people are struggling now, more than they were, I think, in the last, in a couple decades ago. But I do think that people's standards are a lot higher these days than they used to be. And so... and people have a different sort of way of relating to their world, because a lot of the way we relate to our world now is vicariously through entertainment. And we don't feel as much of a desire to interface with other people because we have less irritating options available to us. And so, this is a very different situation, state of affairs that he's describing, and it is kind of dated. It doesn't really describe the way things are these days, I think. It is certain that the coming revolution, like in that respect to the revolution of 1848, will burst upon us in the middle of a great industrial crisis. Things have been seething for half a century now, and can only go from bad to worse. Everything tends that way. New nations entering the, lists of international trade and fighting for possession of the world's markets. I think that comma was probably unnecessary. Wars, taxes ever increasing, national debts, the insecurity of the morrow, and huge colonial undertakings in every corner of the globe. There are millions of unemployed workers in Europe at this moment. It will be still worse when revolution has burst upon us and spread like fire laid to a train of gunpowder. The number of the out-of-works will be doubled as soon as barricades are erected in Europe and the United States. What is to be done to provide these multitudes with bread? We do not know whether the folk who call themselves practical people have ever asked themselves this question in all its nakedness. But we do know that they wish to maintain the wage system, and we must therefore expect to have national workshops and public works vaunted as a means of giving food to the unemployed. Because national workshops were opened in 1789 and in 1793, because the same means were resorted to in 1848, because Napoleon III succeeded in contenting the Parisian proletariat for 18 years by giving them public works, which cost Paris today its debt of 80 million pounds. Really? And its municipal tax of 3 or 4 pounds a head. I never knew that about Napoleon III. Did he just placate the citizens and just rack up a whole bunch of debt? That's crazy. Because this excellent method of taming the beast was customary in Rome and even in Egypt for 4,000 years ago. And lastly, because deposits, kings and emperors have always employed... despots, kings and emperors have always employed the use of... the ruse of throwing a scrap of food to the people to gain time to snatch up the whip. Wow. I made like 3 mistakes in that one sentence. Jesus. God. Just being unable to read is really annoying. Like, just read what's on the screen. But my brain is bad at that. It mixes up letters and words all the time. It is natural that practical men should extol this method of perpetuating the wage system. What need to rack our brains when we have the time-honored method of the pharaohs at our disposal? A lot of people do have high standards. A lot of people could be housed in cheap SRO-style flop houses like they have in many Asian countries. Here in the West, these things are no longer tolerated. Here it's single-family McMansions or luxury apartments being subsidized. Yes, he was a bread and circus guy, nearly bankrupted his empire. It's why he engaged in a lot of foreign adventures / colonial activities. He spent a good deal of his reign calling debts from people in other countries. What does that mean, calling debts? Yeah, that's pretty miserable. What a joke, dude. Yet, should the revolution be so misguided as to start on this path, it would be lost. In 1848, when the national workshops were opened on February 27th, the unemployment of Paris numbered only 800. A fortnight later, they had already increased to 49,000. They would soon have been 100,000 without counting those who crowded in from the provinces. Yet at that time, trade and manufactures in France only employed half as many hands as today. And we know that in time of revolution, exchange and industry suffer most from the general upheaval. To realize this, we have only to think for a moment of the number of workmen whose labor depends directly or indirectly upon export trade, or of the number of hands employed in producing luxuries whose consumers are the middle-class minority. A revolution in Europe means the unavoidable stoppage of at least half the factories and workshops. It means millions of workers and their families thrown on the streets, and our practical men would seek to avert this truly terrible situation by means of national relief works. That is to say, by means of new industries created on the spot to give work to the unemployed. It is evident, as Proudhon has already pointed out, that the smallest attack upon property will bring in its train the complete disorganization of the system based on private enterprise and wage labor. Society itself will be forced to take production in hand in its entirety and to reorganize it to meet the needs of the whole people. But this cannot be accomplished in a day or a month. It must take a certain time, thus, to reorganize the system of production, and during this time, millions of men will be deprived of the means of subsistence. What then is to be done? There is only one really practical solution of the problem: boldly to face the great task which awaits us, and instead of trying to patch up a situation which we ourselves have made untenable, to proceed to reorganize production on a new basis. Thus, the really practical course of action, in our view, would be that the people should take immediate possession of all the food of the insurgent districts, keeping strict account of it all, that none might be wasted, and that by the aid of these accumulated resources everyone might be able to tide over the crisis. During that time, an agreement would have to be made with factory workers, the necessary raw materials given them, and the means of subsistence assured to them while they work to supply the needs of the agriculture population. For we must not forget that while France weaves silks and satins to deck the wives of German financiers, the Empress of Russia and the Queen of the Sandwich Islands, and while Paris fashions wonderful trinkets and playthings for rich folk the world over, 2/3 of the French peasantry have not proper lamps to give them light, or the implements necessary for modern agriculture. Lastly, unproductive land, of which there is plenty, would have to be turned to the best advantage, poor soils enriched, and rich soils which yet under the present system do not yield a quarter, no, nor a tenth of what they might produce, submitted to intensive culture and tilled with as much care as a market garden or a flower pot. It is impossible to imagine any other practical solution of the problem, and whether we like it or not, sheer force of circumstance will bring it to pass. Okay. Calling in debts, making them pay him back in raw resources. So, yeah, I pay him back for what? I was just kind of like, yeah, I don't know what you're referring to there. Did I just enter Alive? Great work on the Mechanical Animals album review. It is my favorite album. Well, there you go. Continuing on. 3. The most prominent characteristic of capitalism is the wage system, which in brief amounts to this. A man, or a group of men possessing the necessary capital, starts some industrial enterprise. He undertakes to supply the factory or workshops with raw material, to organize production, to pay the employees a fixed wage, and lastly, to pocket the surplus value for profits, under pretext of recouping himself for managing the concern, for running the risks it may involve, and for the fluctuations of price and the market value of the wares. To preserve this system, those who now monopolize capital would be ready to make certain concessions, to share, for example, part of the profits with the workers, or rather to establish a sliding scale, which would oblige them to raise wages when prices were high. In brief, they would consent to certain sacrifices on condition that they were still allowed to direct industry and take its first fruits. Collectivism, as we know, does not abolish wages, though it introduces considerable modifications into the existing order of things. It only substitutes the state, that is to say, representative government, national or local, for the individual employer of labor. Under collectivism, it is the representatives of the nation, or of the district, and their deputies and officials, who are to have the control of industry. It is they who reserve to themselves the right of employing the surplus of production in the interests of all. Moreover, collectivism draws a very subtle but very far-reaching distinction between the work of the laborer and the man who has learned a craft. Unskilled labor in the eyes of the collectivist is simple labor, while the work of the craftsman, the mechanic, the engineer, the man of science, etc. is what Marx calls complex labor and is entitled to a higher wage. But laborers and craftsmen, weavers and men of science are all wage servants of the state, all officials, as was said lately, to gild the pill. The coming revolution can render no greater service to humanity than to make the wage system in all its forms an impossibility and to render communism, which is the negation of wage slavery, the only possible solution. Hey, don't you guys find it ironic that so many left-wing people are against AI art because it's violating their intellectual property? Like, isn't that the most capitalist shit you've ever heard of? For even admitting that the collectivist modification of the present system is possible if introduced gradually during a period of prosperity and peace, though for my part I question its practicability even under such conditions, it would become impossible in a period of revolution, when the need of feeding hungry millions springs up with the first call to arms. A political revolution can be accomplished without shaking the foundations of industry, but a revolution where people lay hands upon property will inevitably paralyze exchange and production. Millions of public money would not suffice for wages to the millions of out-of-works. Not a bad point there. That's kind of a big reason why I'm against revolution. Unless there's a way to kind of secure the success of a revolution, sort of guarantee your investment in a way, but that requires foreign capital, I think. And foreign capital is not going to be invested unless there is a confidence from those capitalists that they'll be able to invest and reap some kind of a reward from it. So we got to work with what is, not what we want to be. And unfortunately, I just think that over and over it's proven that this model that he's talking about, which is basically the model used by every communist revolution, doesn't work. And so they've had to resort to really, really desperate measures in order to keep the revolution alive, so that they don't have to admit to themselves that the revolution failed, or that it's doomed to fail. This point cannot be too much insisted upon. The reorganization of industry on a new basis, and we shall presently show how tremendous this problem is, cannot be accomplished in a few days, nor, on the other hand, will the people submit to be half-starved for years in order to oblige the theorists who uphold the wage system. To tide over the period of stress, they will demand what they have always demanded in such cases: communization of supplies, the giving of rations. Pay him back in exchange for being a protectorate of and getting special trade privileges from France. France would also subsidize and give loans to local rulers in the places France is interested in. Okay. Watch Kenny versus Spenny. No thanks. I know pretty circumspect they're all up in arms about copyright. If they're consistent, they should be all an open source and free creative use. Yeah, exactly. It's fucking stupid. These supposed communists are all about property when it's some new technology that threatens their way of life, you know? Then suddenly property matters to them. I watched your Cinemassacre video on an episode of Kino Casino a couple days ago. Everyone watching really enjoyed it also. Wait, really? What was Kino Casino again? Did Kino Casino watch that video on their show? Is that what happened? What is that show? Can't remember. People brought it up before, and I can't remember what it is. Yes, an investment requires an expectation of a return. Yes, desperate measures like war communism. Yeah. Absolute desperation. Oh, it's Andy Worski? and who's PPP? I don't know PPP. They watched my video? Dude, I would like to see that. That sounds awesome. Yeah, at the end they cover like lolcows and stuff usually. Oh, cool. Some drama streamer who got big during blood sports. They do lolcow and drama stuff nowadays. Okay. Yeah, that's probably more up their alley than fucking Ethan Ralph alt-right politics. That probably wasn't a good route for them to go down. Anyway, it will be in vain to preach patience. The people will be patient no longer. And if food is not put in common, they will plunder the bakeries. Well, here's the thing about all this, right? Is he's talking about the idea of a proletarian revolution. And here's the thing. I think we cannot underestimate the importance of a bourgeois revolution. I think a lot of these left-wingers tended to be quite cynical about bourgeois revolutions. and kind of treated them almost like they were like pointless. But a bourgeois revolution can be a really good thing for the proletariat in the long term, even if it doesn't solve the immediate problem of bread. In the long term, having a country with more checks and balances that can be more responsive to people based on the mood of the country. And we've seen since this book was published, more and more of these bourgeois states appearing, to the point where now every state pretty much is a republic of some sort, except for the ones that are sort of modern 20th century autocracies. There's very few traditional monarchies left. And the ones that have become republics have all extended the franchise. And that's a huge deal. Of course, it doesn't really solve all of our problems, but if you look at all that has been achieved and the way that people have been fed, like I said, the problem of bread has been solved. That's a massive, massive change, and a good change. And it wouldn't have been possible, I think, to nearly the same kind of efficacy without these bourgeois revolutions, and without more than simply the problem of bread, freeing the human spirit to be itself, having freedom of speech and freedom of expression, stuff like that. I mean, there's virtually no country on earth that still has the kind of law that Peter the Great established, that you put a tax on men for having beards on their faces, for instance. You know, that kind of thing is by the wayside now. Even though Russia is currently becoming more and more reactionary, they haven't gotten that bad. And Peter the Great was, by the standards of his day, a very progressive emperor. So I think it's interesting. We can look at this book over 100 years on and see, you know, he was thinking way, I think, beyond where we're currently thinking, because at that time, they weren't really seeing the benefits of what they already had the way that we are now. The benefits hadn't come through really back then the way they have now. And so they were looking even more into the future than we are right now. We've all been kind of placated. It's a very interesting thing. On Kick, it was near the end of the stream. Okay. You made Andy laugh quite a bit. Andy said he likes your stuff. That's cool. That's cool. I don't really like Andy, but I was briefly subscribed to his channel at one point when he was doing videos with Chris. I thought that was when he was most likable. Even Lenin changed his mind about the necessity of a bourgeoisie revolution before full socialism. It's why he implemented the new economic program, which was essentially social market / mutualist. Until Stalin took over from the infighting Soviets, and the rest was history. Yeah. It's what is kind of happening in China still. Belt and Road is just used to get ports and infrastructure from poor countries when they default on the payments. Belt and Road? I don't know what Belt and Road is. But are you talking about, what are you... I'm not... he has changed now. He had quit all drugs and drinking for over a year now. Seems happier. Okay. All right. Yeah. I mean, yeah. It turned out that bourgeois revolution did have benefits. It just took a long time for them to be realized. But that's the strength of our progressive society, I think, is that we are continuing to we're continuing to advance our own conditions, even in a state where we have a lot going against us. We have a lot of disempowerment. Belt and Road is the CCP initiative to invest in other countries. He's referring to the imperialist mercantilism I was talking about before. I figured he was going back to the Napoleon III thing. I kind of was wondering about that because we'd kind of advanced the conversation beyond that by that point. But interesting. Yeah, so it's they're doing neo-imperialism in places like Africa, I guess, which is smart. Anarchy sounds good on paper, but in practice it isn't viable or sustainable. Perhaps. Let's continue. If the people are not strong enough to carry all before them, they will be shot down to give collectivism a fair field for experiment. To this end, order must be maintained at any price. Order, discipline, obedience. And as the capitalists will soon realize that when the people are shot down by those who call themselves revolutionists, the revolution itself will become hateful in the eyes of the masses. They will certainly lend their support to the champions of order, even though they are collectivists. In such a line of conduct, the capitalists will see a means of hereafter crushing the collectivists in their turn. If order is established in this fashion, the consequences are easy to foresee. Not content with shooting down the marauders, the faction of order will search out the ringleaders of the mob. They will set up again the law courts and reinstate the hangman. The most ardent revolutionists will be sent to the scaffold. It will be 1793 all over again. He was totally right about this. He predicted the Russian Revolution perfectly, and every revolution since then. Do not let us forget how reaction triumphed in the last century. First, the Hébertists, the madmen, were guillotined. I don't know who's Hébert. Those whom Mignet, with the memory of the struggle fresh upon him, still called anarchists. The Dantonists soon followed them, and when the party of Robespierre had guillotined these revolutionaries, they in their turn had to mount the scaffold, whereupon the people, sick of bloodshed and seeing the revolution lost, threw up the sponge and let the reactionaries do their worst. If order is restored, we say, the Social Democrats will hang the anarchists. The Fabians will hang the Social Democrats. Who are the Fabians? And will in their turn be hanged by the reactionaries. And revolution will come to an end. I've heard of the Fabian Society. Is that what he's talking about? I don't know what that is. But everything confirms us in the belief that the energy of the people will carry them far enough, and that when the revolution takes place, the idea of anarchist communism will have gained ground. Why? I see. That's kind of the big obstacle here is the fact that anarcho-communism is not very popular or well known. Um, it is not an artificial idea. The people themselves have breathed it in our ear, and the number of communists is ever increasing, as the impossibility of any other solution becomes more and more evident. Yeah, sorry, I was a little behind and didn't realize. Okay. It's another word to describe democratic socialists. You're talking about the, well, are you talking about the Fabians? Or the Abertists? Because it says the Fabians will hang the Social Democrats, so that wouldn't make sense if they're the same thing. And if the impetus of the people is strong enough, affairs will take a very different turn. Instead of plundering the bakers' shops one day and starving the next, the people of the insurgent cities will take possession of the warehouses, the cattle markets, and in fact all the provision stores and of all the food to be had. The well-intentioned citizens, men and women both, will form themselves into bands of volunteers and address themselves to the task of making a rough general inventory of the contents of each shop and warehouse. In 24 hours, the revolted town or district will know what Paris has. I mean, you're making all these assumptions. Yeah, people will just naturally do this. Yeah, they'll make volunteer bands and get together and make inventory, and it's like, how do you know any of this is gonna happen? Like, how are people gonna organize themselves without any kind of government or authority? You know, like, how the fuck is any of that gonna happen? In 24 hours, the revolted town or district will know what Paris has not found out yet, in spite of its statistical committees, and what it never did find out during the siege: the quantity of provisions it contains. In 48 hours, millions of copies will be printed of the tables giving a sufficiently exact amount of the available food, the places where it is stored, and the means of distribution. There's a lot of assumptions he's making. In every block of houses, in every street, in every town ward, bands of volunteers will have been organized. These commissariat volunteers will work in unison and keep touch with each other. If only the Jacobin bayonets do not get in the way. If only the self-styled scientific theorists do not thrust themselves in to darken counsel. Okay. Or rather than expound their muddle-headed theories as much as they like, provided they have no authority, no power, and that admirable spirit of organization inherent in the people, above all in every social grade of the French nation. But which they have so seldom been allowed to exercise, will initiate, even in so huge a city as Paris, and in the midst of a revolution, an immense guild of free workers ready to furnish each and all the necessary food. See, I would maybe understand it if there was a big... This is kind of where we're getting into anarcho-syndicalism. We're talking about an immense guild of free workers. If this guild of free workers happened before the revolution, like, say, industrial workers of the world, if this guild organized before the revolution and managed to get a significant percentage of the workers of the world in its guild, and this guild is a decentralized sort of not not authoritarian structure, a libertarian guild, then I could maybe see this working. Because then the guild would appropriate all of the property for itself. But it's just the idea that all this is going to happen very spontaneously that I'm not understanding. Give the people a free hand, and in 10 days the food service will be conducted with admirable regularity. Only those who have never seen the people hard at work, only those who have passed their lives buried among documents can doubt it. Really? You think so? Speak of the organizing genius of the great misunderstood, the people, to those who have seen it in Paris in the days of the barricades. Didn't you just say that the commune failed because they weren't taking into account the needs of the need of bread? I mean, okay. Maybe you're talking about the people who are in charge of the commune. That it was the mere fact of people being in charge of the commune that ruined it. Fair enough. Or in London during the Great Dockers' Strike, when 500,000 of starving folk had to be fed. And they would tell you how superior it is to the official ineptness of bumbledom. Bumbledom. Huh. That was a good choice from the translator there. Bumbledom. Sure. Okay. When people need to be fed, they'll figure out how to feed themselves, I think is the point here. When property is not hoarded by anyone, then the people will figure out how to feed themselves. Maybe that's true. I don't know. And even supposing we had to endure a certain amount of discomfort and confusion for a fortnight or a month, surely that would not matter very much. For the mass of the people, it would still be an improvement on their former condition. And besides, in times of revolution, one can dine contentedly on enough on a bit of bread and cheese while eagerly discussing events. True. True. I would say true. But, that can only last, as this guy's well aware, that can only last for so long. In any case, a system which springs up spontaneously under stress of immediate need will be infinitely preferable to anything invented between four walls by hidebound theorists sitting on any number of committees. Yeah, I would agree with that. If you're talking about resource distribution, probably. Interesting. What do you guys think about this? Sup, homie. Some left-wingers draw a distinction between democratic socialists and social democrats, the distinction being that one is for electoral politics and the other syndicalist/trade union focused. Huh, weird. So which one's which? Are the democratic socialists the syndicalists? Personally, I think they're the same thing. But there's differences in approach within that category. 4. The people of the great towns will be driven by force of circumstance to take possession of all the provisions, beginning with the barest necessities, and gradually extending communism to other things in order to satisfy the needs of all the citizens. The sooner it is done, the better. The sooner it is done, the less misery there will be, and the less strife. But upon what basis must society be organized in order that all may share and share alike? That is the question that meets us at the outset. We answer that there are no two ways of it. There is only one way in which communism can be established equitably, only one way which satisfies our instincts of justice, and is at the same time practical, namely the system already adopted by the agrarian communes of Europe. Take, for example, a peasant commune, where no matter where, even in France, where the Jacobins have done their best to destroy all communal usage, if the commune possesses woods and copses, then so long as there is plenty of wood for all, everyone can take as much as he wants without other let or hindrance than the public opinion of his neighbors. As to the timber trees, which are always scarce, they have to be carefully apportioned. The same with communal pasture land. While there is enough and to spare, no limit is put to what the cattle of each homestead may consume. To what the cattle of each homestead may consume. Okay. Nor to the number of beasts grazing upon the pastures. Grazing grounds are not divided, nor is fodder doled out, unless there is scarcity. All the Swiss communes, and many of those in France and Germany too, wherever there is communal pasture land, practice this system. Wasn't there a thing called the tragedy of the communes that was criticizing this very system, saying that it was impossible? Isn't that a thing that conservatives bring up all the time? Is that just a myth, or is that true? Because this guy is basically saying that that's not true. That the Swiss communes and those in France and Germany practice it just fine. Which I didn't even really know that these were a thing. I mean, I knew about the whole thing with like the commons, common land, common grazing pastures and woods and stuff. But I guess I never considered them like actual communes. And in the countries of Eastern Europe, where there are great forests and no scarcity of land, you find the peasants felling the trees as they need them and cultivating as much soil as they require without any thought of limiting each man's share of timber or land. But the timber will be divided, and the land parceled out to each household according to its needs as soon as either becomes scarce, as is already the case in Russia. And in the countries of Eastern Europe, where there are great forests and no scarcity of land. Sorry, I already read that. In a word, the system is this. No stint or limit to what the community possesses in abundance, but equal sharing and dividing of those commodities which are scarce or apt to run short. Of the 350 millions who inhabit Europe, 200 millions still follow this system of natural communism. It is a fact worth remarking that the same system prevails in the great towns, or in the distribution of one commodity at least, which is found in abundance, the water supplied to each house. As long as there is no fear of supply running short, no water company thinks of checking the consumption of water in each house. Take what you please. But during the great droughts, if there is any fear of supply falling, the water companies know that all they have to do is make known the fact by means of a short advertisement in the papers, and the citizens will reduce their consumption of water and not let it run to waste. That's still true today. But if water were actually scarce, what would be done? Recourse would be had to a system of rations. Such a measure is so natural, so inherent in common sense, that Paris twice asked to be put on rations during the two sieges which it underwent in 1871. That's the thing. They both are for the same thing. They just disagree on the need for parliaments and elections. They do? Um, and part of the tragedy of the Commons argument is that a communal system on a small scale works fine, but when scaled up to large populations, the commune system fails. Conservatives are skeptical of it even working at a small scale. This guy doesn't seem skeptical, though. Is it necessary to go into details, to prepare tables showing how the distribution of rations may work, to prove that it is just and equitable, infinitely more just and equitable than the existing state of things? All these tables and details will not serve to convince those of the middle classes, nor, alas, those of the workers tainted with middle-class prejudices who regard the people as a mob of savages ready to fall upon and devour each other directly the government ceases to direct affairs. It's a bit of a clumsy sort of double use of the word direct. But those only who have never seen the people resolve and act on their own initiative could doubt for a moment that if the masses were masters of the situation, they would distribute rations to each and all in strict accordance with justice and equity. I have to be removed for but a moment. I don't think it'll be the 30 minutes that it was last time, but I do have to be removed for a minute, so I'll be back soon. If you were to give utterance in any gathering of people to the opinion that delicacies, game and such like, should be reserved for the fastidious palates of aristocratic idlers, and black bread given to the sick in the hospitals, you would be hissed. But say at the same gathering, preach at the street corners and in the marketplaces that the most tempting delicacies ought to be kept for the sick and feeble, especially for the sick. Say that if there are only 5 brace of partridge in the entire city, and only 1 case of sherry wine, they should go to sick people and convalescents. Say that after the sick come the children. For them, the milk of the cows and goats should be reserved, if there is not enough for all. To the children and the aged, the last piece of meat. And to the strong man, dry bread, if the community be reduced to that extremity. That's... No. What? You give to the people who need the energy, the strong men who are doing the hardest work. You give them the best food. That's but the thing is that doesn't fly with the whole scarcity thing. So but also children, I guess, do need good food because they need to be able to grow tall. So that's another thing to consider. So I guess you start with the children, maybe, for the good food. And then I guess, pregnant women. Yeah, I guess that does kind of leave the strong men at the end. Although the sick people don't need that much food, really, because they're just kind of in bed for a lot of the time. So I wouldn't say that you start with the sick people. Say, in a word, that if this or that article of consumption runs short and has to be doled out to those who have the most need, most should be given. Say that, and see if you do not meet with universal agreement. The man who is full-fed does not understand this, but the people do understand, have always understood it, and even the child of luxury. If he is thrown onto the street and comes into contact with the masses, even he will learn to understand. The theorists, for whom the soldier's uniform and the barrack mess table are civilization's last word, would like no doubt to start a regime of national kitchens and Spartan broth. They would point out the advantages thereby gained, the economy in fuel and food, if such huge kitchens were established where everyone could come for their rations of soup and bread and vegetables. We do not question these advantages. We are well aware that important economies have already been achieved in this direction, as for instance when the hand mill or quern and baker's oven attached to each house were abandoned. We can see perfectly well that it would be more economical to cook broth for 100 families at once instead of lighting 100 separate fires. We know, besides, that there are 1,000 ways of doing up potatoes, but that cooked in one huge pot for 100 families, they would be just as good. We know, in fact, that variety in cooking being a matter of the seasoning introduced by each cook or housewife, the cooking together of 100 weight of potatoes would not prevent each cook or housewife from dressing and serving them as in any way she pleased. And we know that stock made from meat can be converted into 100 different soups to suit 100 different tastes. But though we are quite aware of all these facts, we still maintain. I mean, we're talking about basically what we have today, kind of like people buying mass-produced chicken stock from the store. But though we are quite aware of all these facts, we still maintain that no one has a right to force the housewife to take her potatoes from the communal kitchen ready cooked if she prefers to cook them herself in her own pot on her own fire. And above all, we should wish each one to be free to take his meals with his family or with his friends or even in a restaurant, if so seem good to him. Naturally, large public kitchens will spring up to take the place of restaurants, where people are poisoned nowadays. Already, the Parisian housewife gets the stock for her soup from the butcher and transforms it into whatever soup she likes, and London housekeepers know that they can have a joint roasted or an apple or rhubarb tart baked at the baker's for a trifling sum, thus economizing time and fuel. And when the communal kitchen, the common bakehouse of the future, is established, and people can get their food cooked without the risk of being cheated or poisoned, the custom will no doubt become general of going to the communal kitchen for the fundamental parts of the meal, leaving the last touches to be added as individual taste shall suggest. We're talking about some world of the future stuff here. But it's kind of describing what we already have in some senses. It's not a communal kitchen, but we have supermarkets where we have like prepackaged stuff that's all ready to go. You still have to pay for them, though, whereas in his system, you wouldn't have to pay for it. But to make a hard and fast rule... But to make a hard and fast rule of this, to make a duty of taking home our food ready cooked, that it would be as repugnant to our modern minds as the ideas of the convent or the barrack, morbid ideas born in brains warped by tyranny or superstition. I read that sentence all wrong. Let me read it again. But to make a hard and fast rule of this, to make a duty of taking home our food ready cooked, that would be as repugnant to our modern minds as the ideas of the convent or the barrack, morbid ideas born in brains warped by our tyranny or superstition. Who will have a right to the food of the commune? Will assuredly be the first question, which we shall have to ask ourselves. Every township will answer for itself, and we are convinced that the answers will be dictated by the sentiment of justice. Until labor is reorganized, as long as the disturbed period lasts, and while it is impossible to distinguish between inveterate idlers and genuine workers thrown out of work, the available food ought to be shared by all without exception. Those who have been enemies to the new order will hasten of their own accord to rid the commune of their presence. But it seems to us that the masses of the people, which have always been magnanimous, and have nothing of vindictiveness in their disposition, will be ready to share their bread with all who remain with them, conquered and conquerors alike. It will be no loss to the revolution to be inspired by such an idea. And when work is set a-going again, the antagonists of yesterday will stand side by side in the same workshops. A society where work is free will have nothing to fear from idlers. Okay. I mean, as long as we can, ensure that people work. But provisions will run short in a month, our critics at once exclaim. So much the better, say we. It will prove that for the first time on record, the people have had enough to eat. As to the question of obtaining fresh supplies, we shall discuss the means in our next chapter. 5. This is quite a long chapter. By what means could a city in a state of revolution be supplied with food? We shall answer this question. But it is obvious that the means resorted to will depend on the character of the revolution in the provinces and in neighboring countries. If the entire nation, or better still, if all Europe, should accomplish the social revolution simultaneously and start with thoroughgoing communism, our procedure would be simplified. But if only a few communities in Europe make the attempt, other means will have to be chosen. The circumstances will dictate the measures. Ain't that the truth? We are thus led, before we proceed further, to glance at the state of Europe, and, without pretending to prophecy, we may try to foresee what course the revolution will take, or at least what will be its essential features. Certainly, it would be very desirable that all Europe should rise at once, that expropriation should be general, and that communistic principles should inspire all and sundry. Such a universal rising would do much to simplify the task of our century, but all the signs lead us to believe that it will not take place, that the revolution will embrace Europe. We do not doubt. If one of the four great continental capitals, Paris, Vienna, Brussels, or Berlin, rises in revolution and overturns its government, it is almost certain that the three others will follow its example within a few weeks' time. I mean, didn't that already kind of happen? It is, moreover, highly probable that the peninsulas and even London and St. Petersburg would not be long in following suit. But whether the revolution would everywhere exhibit the same characteristics is doubtful. Though it is more than probable that expropriation will be everywhere carried into effect on a larger or smaller scale, and that this policy carried out by any one of the great nations of Europe will influence all the rest, yet the beginnings of the revolution will exhibit great local differences, and its course will vary in different countries. In 1789 to 93, the French peasantry took 4 years to finally rid themselves of the redemption of feudal rights, and the bourgeois to overthrow royalty. Let us keep that in mind, therefore, and be prepared to see the revolution develop itself somewhat gradually. Let us not be disheartened if here and there its steps should move less rapidly. Whether it would take an avowedly socialist character in all European nations, at any rate at the beginning, is doubtful. Germany, be it remembered, is still realizing its dream of a united empire. Its advanced parties see visions of a Jacobin republic like that of 1848, and of the organization of labor according to Louis Blanc. While the French people, on the other hand, want above all things a free commune, whether it be a communist commune or not. There is every reason to believe that when the coming revolution takes place, Germany will go further than France went in 1793. The 18th century revolution in France was an advance on the English Revolution of the 17th, abolishing as it did at one stroke the power of the throne and the landed aristocracy, whose influence still survives in England. But if Germany goes further and does greater things than France did in 1793, there can be no doubt that the ideas which will foster the birth of a revolution will be those of 1848. As the ideas which will inspire the revolution in Russia will be those of 1798, modified somewhat by the intellectual movements of our own century. That was wrong. that was wrong. It was actually Russia who went through the dramatic revolution of 1848. And Germany had an attempt to do that, specifically in the north, with Rosa Luxemburg, but that revolution failed, and, they were kind of just at the mercy then, at that point, of the conquering Entente powers. Without, however, attaching to these forecasts a greater importance than they merit, we may safely conclude this much. The revolution will take a different character in each of the different European nations. The point attained in the socialization of wealth will not everywhere be the same. Will it therefore be necessary, as is sometimes suggested, that the nations in the vanguard of the movement should adapt their pace to those who lag behind? Must we wait till the communist revolution is ripe in all civilized countries? Clearly not. Shall we wait until socialism comes to Timbuktu? Even if it were a thing to be desired, it is not possible. History does not wait for the laggards. Besides, we do not believe that in any one country the revolution will be accomplished at a stroke, in the twinkling of an eye, as some socialists dream. It is highly probable that if one of the 5 or 6 large towns of France, Paris, Lyon, Marseille, Lille, Saint-Étienne, Bordeaux, were to proclaim the commune, the others would follow its example. And that many smaller towns would do the same. Probably also various mining districts and industrial centers would hasten to rid themselves of owners and masters and form themselves into free groups. But many country places have not advanced to that point. Side by side with the revolutionized communes, such places would remain an expectant attitude and would go on living on the individualist system, undisturbed by visits of the bailiff or the tax collector. The peasants would not be hostile to the revolutionaries, and thus, while profiting by the new state of affairs, they would defer the settlement of accounts with the local exploiters. Okay. But with that practical enthusiasm, which always characterizes agrarian uprisings, witness the passionate toil of 1792, they would throw themselves into the task of cultivating the land, which, freed from taxes and mortgages, would become so much dearer to them. As to abroad, revolution would break out everywhere, but revolution under diverse aspects. In one country, state socialism; in another, federation; everywhere, more or less, socialism not conforming to any particular rule. That kind of didn't happen. It all just kind of conformed to Marxism-Leninism in the 20th century. Except for when there were really, war-torn areas. Having dinner, we'll be back. Man, every time I leave, you guys are going to have dinner. Six. Wow, this chapter has a lot of sections. I guess we're only reading this one chapter today. How many sections do we have left? We have 6, 7. Okay, 2 sections left. We'll read these 2 sections and then end the stream. 6. Let us now return to our city in revolt and consider how its citizens can provide foodstuffs for themselves. How are the necessary provisions to be obtained if the nation as a whole has not accepted communism? This is the question to be solved. Take, for example, one of the large French towns. Take the capital itself, for that matter. Paris consumes every year thousands of tons of grain, 350,000 head of oxen, 200,000 calves, 300,000 swine, and more than 2 millions of sheep, besides great quantities of game. This huge city devours, besides, 18 million pounds of butter, 172 million eggs, and other produce in like proportion. It imports flour and grain from the United States and from Russia, Hungary, Italy, Egypt, and the Indies, livestock from Germany, Italy, Spain, even Romania and Russia. And as for groceries, there is not a country in the world that it does not lay under contribution. Now let us see how Paris, or even other great or any other great town, could be revictualled by homegrown produce. Wow, that's victual is a word that I forgot about. I don't even know if I remember what it meant, but it sounds so familiar. Supplies of which could be readily and willingly sent from the provinces. To those who put their trust in authority, the question will appear quite simple. They would begin by establishing a strongly centralized government furnished with all the machinery of coercion, the police, the army, the guillotine. This government would draw up a statement of all the produce it contained in France. It would divide the country into districts of supply and then command that a prescribed quantity of some particular foodstuff be sent to such a place on such a day and delivered at such a station, and there be received on a given day by a specified official and stored in particular warehouses. Now we declare with the fullest conviction not merely that such a solution is undesirable, but that it could never by any possibility be put into practice. It is wildly utopian. This guy knew. He knew back in the day that this was a pipe dream. And did they listen? No, they didn't. Pen in hand, one may dream such a dream in the study, but in contact with reality, it comes to nothing. For, like all such theories, it leaves out of account the spirit of independence that is in man. The attempt would lead to a universal uprising, to 3 or 4 Vendées, to the villages rising up against the towns, all the country in arms defending the city for its arrogance and attempting to impose such a system upon the country. Defying the city. We have already had too much of Jacobin utopias. Let us see if some other form of organization will meet the cause. Yeah, this is an interesting kind of case with fascism where fascism kind of recognized this truth as well. And so it made no attempt to order the supply of goods in a totally holistic way. To totally transform the country into one big kind of factory with central management. It made no attempt to do that. It recognized that people needed some amount of independence. But at the same time, it didn't have like this sort of libertarian socialist solution to the problem. Because it was, I think, rightly skeptical of that working too, because it was just something that hadn't really properly been tried. And would seem to kind of dismantle a lot of the strength that comes from a centralized authority, like the kind that they experienced during World War I in the army. And so they felt that this kind of authority needed to be kept alive and needed to be kept strong, and that this authority could do anything it wanted to do within reason. It couldn't order around the entire country like a factory, but perhaps it could direct the energies of the country in ways that would be advantageous to it. And so that was kind of the theory of fascism, that yes, you needed the emancipation of the worker, but you could only do it through a strong state, that everything would be consolidated in the state, but that the state couldn't micromanage every aspect of production. It could only direct production, if where it was sensible and possible and practicable to do so. And so you needed to make concessions to the power structure as it existed, and you needed to expect that those who owned capital would need to be treated with respect and not thrown out. In 1793, the provinces starved the large towns and killed the revolution. And yet it is a known fact that the production of grain in France during 1792 to 93 had not diminished. Indeed, the evidence goes to show that it had increased. But after having taken possession of the manorial lands, after having reaped a harvest from them, the peasants would not part with their grain for paper money. They withheld their produce, waiting for a rise in the price or the introduction of gold. The most rigorous measures of the National Convention were without avail, and even the fear of death failed to break up the ring or force its members to sell their corn. For it is matter of history that the commissaries of the conventions did not scruple to guillotine those who withheld their grain from the market, and pitilessly executed those who speculated in foodstuffs. All the same, the corn was not forthcoming, and the townsfolk suffered from famine. That's crazy. That's crazy that they couldn't even, with under threat of death, they couldn't even get these people to sell their corn. That's nuts. How do you expect to solve that problem, Kropotkin? But what was offered to the husbandman what was offered to the husbandman in exchange for this hard toil? Assignats. Scraps of paper decreasing in value every day, promises of payment which could not be kept. A 40-pound note would not purchase a pair of boots, and the peasant very naturally was not anxious to barter a year's toil for a piece of paper with which he could not even buy a shirt. True. As long as worthless paper money, whether called assignats or labor notes, is offered to the peasant producer, it'll always be the same. The country will withhold its produce, and the towns will suffer want, even if the recalcitrant peasants are guillotined as before. We must offer to the peasant in exchange for his toil, not worthless paper money, but the manufactured articles of which he stands in immediate need. Yes, I agree with this. He lacks the proper implements to till the land, clothes to protect him properly from the inclemencies of the weather, lamps and oil to replace his miserable rushlight or tallow dip, spades, rakes, plows. All these things, under present conditions, the peasant is forced to do without, not because he does not feel the need of them, but because, in his life of struggle and privation, 1,000 useful things are beyond his reach, because he has no money to buy them. Let the town apply itself, without loss of time, to manufacturing all that the peasant needs, instead of fashioning... Whoa, that's a weird word. Gewgaws? I've never seen that word in my life. Instead of fashioning whatever that is for the wives of rich citizens, let the sewing machines of Paris be set to work on clothes for the country folk, work-day clothes and clothes for Sunday, too, instead of costly evening dresses. Let the factories and foundries turn out agricultural implements, spades, rakes, and such like, instead of waiting till the English send them to France in exchange for French wines. This is fascinating, because this is the same stuff that Oswald Mosley was talking about in the 1920s, believe it or not. He was saying that Britain needs to focus on developing its home industry to serve the needs of British people, instead of relying on exports for everything. That's fascinating that Peter Kropotkin was writing about the same thing in the 1890s that Mosley was writing about in the 1920s. It really shows, how much overlap there was between the thought of. Mosley wasn't technically a fascist at that time yet, but between fascist and socialist thought, they're really not as different as people believe, even though they are different. Believe in Jesus, rapture soon? No. No on both counts. I love Michael Malice. I'm loving to see this. I don't know who Michael Malice is. Respect to the rights and the allowance of trade between these individuals freely. Protect people from this, especially in societies with entrepreneurialism and high saliency for information. And what we're dealing with today. Let the towns send no more inspectors to the villages wearing red, blue, or rainbow-colored scarves to convey to the peasant orders to take his produce to this place or that, but let them send friendly embassies to the country folk and bid them in brotherly fashion, bring us your produce and take from our stores and shops all the manufactured articles you please. Then provisions would pour in on every side. It's kind of simple. I kind of like the idea of this. The peasant would only withhold what he needed for his own use and would send the rest into the cities, feeling for the first time in the course of history that these toiling townsfolk were his comrades, his brethren, and not his exploiters. We shall be told perhaps that this would necessitate a complete transformation of industry. Well, yes, that is true of certain departments, but there are other branches which could be rapidly modified in such a way as to furnish the peasant with clothes, watches, furniture, and the simple implements for which the towns make him pay such exorbitant rates at the present time. Weavers, tailors, shoemakers, tinsmiths, cabinet makers, and many other trades and crafts could easily direct their energies to the manufacture of useful and necessary articles and abstain from producing mere luxuries. All that is needed is that the public mind should be thoroughly convinced of the necessity of this transformation and should come to look upon it as an act of justice and of progress, and that it should no longer allow itself to be cheated by that dream so dear to the theorists, that the dream of a revolution which confines itself to taking possession of the profits of industry and leaves production and commerce just as they are now. I added a that to the beginning of that little phrase. This, then, is our view of the whole question. Cheat the peasant no longer with scraps of paper, be the sums inscribed upon them ever so large, but offer him in exchange for his produce the very things of which he, the tiller of the soil, stands in need. Then the fruits of the land will be poured into the towns. If this is not done, there will be famine in our cities, and reaction and despair will follow in its train. Yeah, they should have bribed them. They were focused on, like, hey, do your part, but they weren't looking at, like, why they aren't doing their part. They should have been like, well, if they won't give us grain, we got to give them something in return. Makes sense. Seven. All the great towns, we have said, buy their grain, their flour, and their meat, not only from the provinces, but also from abroad. Foreign countries send Paris spices, fish, and various dainties, besides immense quantities of corn and meat. But when the revolution comes, we must depend on foreign countries as little as possible. If Russian wheat, Italian or Indian rice, and Spanish or Hungarian wines abound in the markets of Western Europe, it is not that the countries which export them have a superabundance, or that such a produce grows there of itself, like the dandelion in the meadows. In Russia, for instance, the peasant works 16 hours a day and half starves from 3 to 6 months every year in order to export the grain with which he pays the landlord and the state. Today, the police appears in the Russian village as soon as the harvest is gathered in and sells the peasant's last horse and cow for arrears of taxes and rent due to the landlord, unless the victim immolates himself of his own accord by selling the grain to the exporters. Usually, rather than part with his livestock at a disadvantage, he keeps only a 9-month supply of grain and sells the rest. Then, in order to sustain life until the next harvest, he mixes birch bark and tares with his flour for 3 months if it has been a good year, and for 6 if it has been bad. While in London, they are eating biscuits made of his wheat. But as soon as the revolution comes, the Russian peasant will keep bread enough for himself and his children. The Italian and Hungarian peasants will do the same. And the Hindu, let us hope, will profit by these good examples. And the farmers of America will hardly be able to cover all the deficit in grain which Europe will experience. So it will not do to count on their contributions of wheat and maize satisfying all the wants. So you gotta learn self-sufficiency then. Since all our middle-class civilization is based on the exploitation of inferior races and countries with less advanced industrial systems, the revolution will confer a boon at the very outset by menacing that civilization and allowing the so-called inferior races to free themselves. But this great benefit will manifest itself by a steady and marked diminution of the food supplies pouring into the great cities of Western Europe. It is difficult to predict the course of affairs in the provinces. On the one hand, the slave of the soil will take advantage of the revolution to straighten his abode back. Instead of working 14 or 15 hours a day, as he does at present, he will be at liberty to work only half that time, which, of course, would have the effect of decreasing the production of the principal articles of consumption, grain and meat. But on the other hand, there will be an increase of production as soon as the peasant realizes that he is no longer forced to support the idle rich by his toil. New tracts of land will be cleared, new and improved machines set a-going. Really? Never was the land so energetically cultivated as in 1792, when the peasant had taken back from the landlord the soil which he had coveted so long, Michelet tells us, speaking of the Great Revolution. So he's saying that the peasants will kind of cut their work in half, but then when they realize that they're no longer forced to support the idle rich, they'll increase production again. I don't really understand how that works. Malice is an anarchist writer. He has a compilation book on anarchism called The Anarchist Handbook, where his point was anarchism is a relationship between people. Off topic, but I just wanted to say I really enjoyed the recent Fundamental Loathsome video you posted the other day. Looking forward to the next episode. Okay. Thank you. He has Bakunin and Kropotkin in there, but I'm more of an Emma Goldman guy. Okay. Let's see. Before long, intensive culture would be within the reach of all. Improved machinery, chemical manures, and all such matters would be common property. But everything tends to indicate that at the outset there'd be a falling off in agricultural products in France as elsewhere. Yes. In any case, it would be wisest to count upon such a falling off of contributions from the provinces as well as from abroad. And how is this falling off to be made good? Why in heaven's name, by setting to work ourselves? No need to rack our brains for far-fetched panaceas when the remedy lies close at hand. Okay. The large towns must undertake to till the soil, like the country districts. We must return to what biology calls the integration of functions after the division of labor, the taking up of it as a whole. This course followed throughout nature. This is the course followed throughout nature. Besides, philosophy apart, the force of circumstances would bring about this result. Let Paris see the end of 8 months. To see that at the end of 8 months, it will be running short of bread, and Paris will set to work to grow wheat. Where do you grow wheat in Paris? Do you just grow it in the surrounding countryside? Isn't that stuff already being used? That's funny. He's answering the question right here. What about land? It will not be wanting, for it is round the great towns, and round Paris especially, that parks and pleasure grounds of the landed gentry are to be found. These thousands of acres only await the skilled labor of the husbandmen to surround Paris with fields infinitely more fertile and productive than the steppes of southern Russia, where the soil is dried up by the sun. Nor will labor be lacking. To what should the 2 million citizens of Paris turn their attention when they would be no longer catering for the luxurious fads and amusements of Russian princes, Romanian grandees, and the wives of Berlin financiers? Well, all well and good, that idea, but I have one concern, which is just the skill set of the urban worker is not apt for agriculture. Now, that's something you can learn, but who's going to be teaching them? It's not something that everyone can just immediately get to work on. People can't just, oh yeah, we're getting to work on agriculture now. People have to be trained how to do it. People have to learn how to adjust themselves to the life of a farmer. And know how to weather the kind of good times and bad times. Now, it would be easier to do that when you don't have to pay for things. But it'll still be a situation where, like, if you don't know all the techniques of how to farm properly, you're going to get a bad turnout. You're going to get a bad crop. And so food shortages still could occur under this system. And so that's my concern, is that people won't have the skills or experience. Greenhouses and rooftops, that could work too. Besides, philosophy apart, the forces of circumstances would bring about this result. Let Paris see that at the end of 8 months, it'll be running short of bread, and Paris will set to work growing wheat. I'm sorry, I already read that. With all the mechanical inventions of the century, with all the intelligence and technical skill of the worker accustomed to deal with complicated machinery, with inventors, chemists, professors of botany, practical botanists like the market gardeners of Gennevilliers, with the... Sorry, it would not be Gennevilliers, it would be like Gennevilliers. Something like that, Gennevilliers. With the plant that they could use for multiplying and improving machinery, and finally with the organizing spirit of the Parisian people, their pluck and energy. With all these at its command, the agriculture of the anarchist commune of Paris would be a very different thing from the rude husbandry of the Ardennes. Is it the Ardennes? as we've established with French plurals, Ardennes. So the workers would be accustomed to machinery, inventors, chemists, professors of botany, practical botanists. Would this be enough to compensate for the industrial workers' lack of experience with farming? Perhaps. I don't know. Perhaps you could get experts to who understand farming, because there would be a lot of them in these towns. You could get them to go around and, for one thing, hand out farmers' almanacs to the people. I'm assuming most of them are literate by this time, because this is the 1890s. So most French people would be literate, especially those in cities, by this point. So you can give them, hand out farmers' almanacs, make sure they're acquainted with the basics of farming, and just get these people to pass around to tour the country and to kind of check in on all of the farmers and make sure that their techniques are up to date. It could work. It could work. I could see that working. That could be a job for some of these more well-read people in Paris who are familiar with agriculture. Steam, electricity, the heat of the sun, and the breath of the wind will ere long be pressed into service. The steam harrow and steam plow will quickly do the rough work of preparation, and the soil, thus cleaned and enriched, will only need the intelligent care of man and of woman, even more than man, to be clothed with luxuriant vegetation, not once but three or four times in the year. All right. So, industrialized farming. It has proven to be a great sort of streamliner of agriculture, thus kind of transitioning us into a service economy. Thus, learning the art of horticulture from experts and trying experiments in different methods on small patches of soil reserved for the purpose, vying with each other to obtain the best returns, finding in physical exercise without exhaustion or overwork the health and strength which so often flags in cities. Men, women, and children will gladly turn to the labor of the fields when it is no longer a slavish drudgery, but has become a pleasure, a festival, a renewal of health and joy. There are no barren lands. The earth is worth what man is worth. That is the last word of modern agriculture. Ask of the earth, and she will give you bread, provided that you ask aright. A district, though it were as small as the departments of the Seine and the Seine-et-Oise, and with so great a city as Paris to feed, would be practically sufficient to grow upon it all the food supplies, which otherwise might fail to reach it. The combination of agriculture and industry, the husbandman and the mechanic in the same individual, and this is what anarchist communism will inevitably lead us to, if it starts fair with expropriation. Let the revolution only get so far, and famine is not the enemy it will have to fear. No, the danger which will menace it lies in timidity, prejudice, and half-measures. The danger is where Danton saw it when he cried to France, there, and again there, yet and yet again there. The bold thought first, and the bold deed will not fail to follow. That's chapter 5. We will read chapter 6 next time. Gardening and agricultural practices do require a good deal of training and practice. Agricultural trade schools. Modern farming techniques doesn't require a lot of physical labor aside from picking, sorting, and packing. Yeah, plowing and harvesting have been kind of streamlined when it comes to corn, especially. Plowing and watering are very streamlined. Fertilizing, very streamlined. But picking, yes, does require a lot of labor. I'm going to see if I can find that Kino Casino thing. That sounded interesting to me. But that's the third installment of our journey into anarchism. We are, let's see, we're a little bit under halfway through the book. Looks like we're about 2/5 of the way through the book. So we still have quite a bit to go. That means we might be done after, say, 12 installments. Maybe 12 installments will get us through. 11, perhaps. $11 sounds right. 10 or 11 will get us through the book. Let me know if you find a link to that. I'd be interested in seeing Kino's reaction. Yeah, that kind of interested me.